Okay, welcome to March's legislative meeting hosted by Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. Today is March 25th, 2015, and I will be your host, Andy Russell from Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. This is our agenda for today. We have some great speakers, and I just want to say before we start, I'm really happy to see a lot of the advocates from Rare Disease Week on the line today. This is exactly what we were talking about when we were asking you to follow up and engage with the rare disease community. So if you like any of the bills that you hear about today, jot them down and bring them back to your larger patient community, get sign off, and try to sign on to some of these letters and exciting things happening legislatively and policy within the rare disease community. So first off today, we have Carey from the California Healthcare Institute. Jenny, are you on the line?
I'm here, Andy.
Great. Thank you so much for calling in today, and you can take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you again so much to you and Julia and Max for giving me the opportunity to talk to our friends today. So as Andy introduced me, I'm Carey. I'm Director of Federal Government Relations and Alliance Development at the California Healthcare Institute. If you're not familiar with CHI, we are the statewide public policy and advocacy association representing our state's biomedical innovators. So that's everyone from biopharmaceutical manufacturers, device and diagnostics manufacturers, to academic and private research institutions, as well as venture capitalists throughout the state. And our goal is really, from the kind of innovator perspective, very much in line with that of RDLA's, which is to promote the development of new products and access to innovative therapies, for patients to improve their lives. So I wanted to raise for you all today information about a bill that's been recently introduced in the House. There is not yet a Senate companion, but we're working on that. But the legislation is H.R. 1078. It's called the FDA Safety Over Sequestration Act of 2015. In a nutshell, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but in a nutshell, this is legislation that would protect FDA user fees from sequestration. Some of you may recall that we talked about this issue about 2 years ago, the last time that user fees were sequestered. And you were all very instrumental in helping to actually release the sequestered user fees. But the problem has not been fixed, so we are kind of back at it again, given the threat of sequestration potentially coming back and the threat that FDA may not have access to the money that it needs to conduct its review processes of new drugs and biologics over at FDA. So Andy, thanks for pulling up the next slide. I'm sorry, go back to the slide you just had. Thank you. So in a little more detail, just kind of what is the problem that this bill is trying to address? As many of you may know, FDA increasingly relies on industry-paid user fees to supplement the stagnant and actually, some might say, decreasing appropriations for the FDA and its critical new drug and biologic review activities. On the drug and biologics side of FDA, their funding for their review activities is funded about 60 to 65%. I've actually even heard as high as 75% by user fees. And again, user fees, if you're not familiar with them, are it's basically an application fee that a drug company or device company will pay to the FDA when they submit a new application for a product. So it's kind of like if you're applying to college, there's an application fee. It doesn't actually mean that you're going to get accepted. It just provides resources for, in the case of user fees, for the FDA to actually, hire the staff and provide the resources to conduct these reviews. I would note here too, and that on the device side, it's about 30%. Their review activities are funded by about 30% user fees. So a little bit different ratio, but still obviously a very important part of the agency's budget. I will note that products that are applications for certain and most rare disease orphan drug indications are not subject to user fees. But this is still really an important issue because user fees and appropriations provide resources to the FDA for all of their review activities. It's not like there's some separate, dedicated account, or line item in the budget that goes just towards orphan drug review activities. So user fees as a whole are really important, even for patients and manufacturers of rare disease products, even though they're actually not subject to paying them. As you also may recall, back in 2012, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act renewed FDA's authority to collect these user fees and made a lot of new improvements and changes to the regulatory review processes, things like the new breakthrough therapy designation and the patient-focused drug development program were both new initiatives created under FDASIA, and in exchange for FDA and patients and other consumer groups and industry all really liked those programs and wanted to see them go forward. But in order to see them be successful, the agency needed more resources, and so industry actually agreed to pay increased user fees to support those regulatory system and process improvements. On the back of that, for FY13, there was a sequester, and what that meant was that federal agencies were subject to an across-the-board spending cut. So uniquely for FDA and other kinds of user fee-funded agencies, the Office of Management and Budget made a determination that in addition to congressional appropriations, user fees would be subject to sequestration. So again, this is private money that manufacturers, write. These are large checks they write to the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department is supposed to hand them over to the FDA for its specific purpose of, conducting these review activities. With the sequestration, the FDA's appropriations budget and their user fees were cut by about 5%. For FY13, that actually ended up meaning that $85 million in user fees was sequestered. It was set aside, put in a lockbox over at the Department of Treasury, and FDA did not have access to that money. As I mentioned at the outset, you all were really helpful. About 125 rare disease patient groups, patient advocacy and research groups sent a letter to Congress and urged them to release those $85 million, and ultimately the appropriators, found that advocacy from the patient community was really helpful, and they were able to find $85 million elsewhere in the budget and make FDA whole. So again, thank you again for so many of you on the call today who participated in that advocacy effort 2.5 years ago. It was really helpful. But we're back in a similar position right now. Actually, Andy, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be helpful. Sorry. We're kind of back in a similar situation. There is actually the House is considering the budget today, and they'll probably be continuing to consider that over the next couple of weeks. But there is a threat that sequestration could come back at the beginning of FY16, which would be this October. This is also around the time that the next round of user fee discussions start. So, later this summer and early this fall, the FDA is going to sit down with industry and with some of the, leading patient groups, and they're going to start talking about what does the agency need, and what are the, in terms of financial resources, and what are some of the changes that the, patient and manufacturer and consumer groups would like to see to those review processes, and kind of start hashing out what this detailed package might look like. We pretty much expect that, given that appropriations have been stagnant for many, many years, that in order to make any new reforms or, changes to the regulatory process, industry's going to have to pay more user fees. And with the threat of sequestration starting in September, it's kind of an interesting, unfortunate position where industry's going to be asked to give more money to the FDA, but then FDA is not going to be able to actually use it, or some portion of it. So it's really important that Congress take action now to pass into law legislation that would say FDA user fees are not subject to sequestration, to make sure that all of the money, again, we don't know how much it potentially might be, but that all of the money that is paid to the agency in user fees is able to go to the agency for that specific purpose and will not be touched by sequestration. Andy, can you go to the next slide? So again, this bill is very, very specific. It protects industry-paid user fees from these across-the-board spending cuts due to sequestration in fiscal year 16 and beyond. It only touches user fees that are paid to FDA for drugs, biologics, device, and diagnostics. It doesn't touch other kinds of user fees for things like animal feed and mammography, facility inspection fees, or tobacco. It's very specific to these human health-related user fees. And it also doesn't do anything to protect congressional appropriations. We would certainly love to see that. We would love to not have sequestration, so that the agency is always guaranteed its money, but that's a different process. So the bill actually did nothing to touch on congressional appropriations, but really what it does is just ensure that FDA will have access to the user fees that it is entitled to. Thank you, Andy. We have about 21 co-sponsors on the bill this year. Last Congress, you can see actually I organized this slide for those of you who are looking at it by Republicans on the left and Democrats on the right. Why did I do it that way? I should have flipped it, but you can see that there's a pretty strong bipartisan showing of support for this legislation. And last Congress, I'd note that we had almost 90 co-sponsors on the bill, and just so interesting, if you look at kind of the philosophies of some of the people on here, it's interesting to see, for example, Doug Lamalfa, for those of you who know him, on the same bill as Sam Clark. I mean, these are people who have very different views on many different things, but on this issue, they all agree. So we're still working to get additional co-sponsors. A lot of these are from the California delegation because we've been kind of leading this effort with our friends in the California delegation, also partnering with folks from the New Jersey delegation. The bill itself is led by Anna Eshoo from the Bay Area in California, a Democrat, and Leonard Lance, who, both of these members have done so much for the rare disease community, so these are not unfamiliar names to you, but Congressman Lance, Republican from New Jersey. So basically my request for you all today, one more slide, sorry, endorsements. You can see a great diversity in folks that have already signed on to support this bill. All of the national kind of industry-related associations have endorsed, AdvaMed, Bio, Pharma, Medical Device Manufacturers Association. You can also see the National Health Council, Leukemia Lymphoma Society, and also Generic Pharmaceutical Association, GPHA. Very rare that you have groups like Bio and Pharma and GPHA all together in support of an issue, and on this one they are aligned. So really broad and diverse support for the legislation. I've also included, a couple other slides here, and you can just kind of pop them up for you. If you have questions, this is the congressional staff contacts. They do know that I'm talking to you today, so they won't be surprised if any of you, contact them directly with any questions or to kind of offer your support. But what we're really asking today is, it was included in the e-blast that RDLA sent out yesterday, but we are coordinating a patient sign-on letter to basically endorse the legislation. And last Congress, as I mentioned, about 125 of your groups signed a similar letter, so I'm really hopeful we can get the same kind of strong support from the patient advocacy and research community on the legislation this year. As I said, the letter was linked in the e-blast that RDLA sent out yesterday. I think it was the 4th or 5th item, and I would love to have your support. You can contact me to sign on, or anyone over at Every Life Foundation or RDLA if you'd like to sign. But I can pause and see if there's any questions.
Great, Jenny. Thank you so much for that informative presentation. This is a big issue for the rare disease community, and I'd love to see our advocates help out like they did last time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So does anybody have any questions on the line? You can send them to the chat, and I will bring them up and ask Jenny, or, you can email Jenny here or call her. Here's her number and her email. But as I see no questions on the line, I will move on to Stephanie Krenner.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Stephanie, are you on the line?
I am on the line. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Ensuring Access to Clinical Trials Act. This is some legislation that we've been working on for the last few months, and I just wanted to make sure that folks in the rare disease community were aware of it and aware of kind of what you can do to help support it. So again, my name is Stephanie Krenrich. I work with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. I'm an Assistant Director of Policy over at the Foundation. We're a private nonprofit up in Bethesda that works to help those with cystic fibrosis. So, and this is an issue that's been near and dear to our hearts for quite a few years. And the legislation that I'm talking about today is the Ensuring Access to Clinical Trials Act. It's S-139 and H.R. 209. It was introduced by Senators Wyden and Hatch and Brown and Markey in the Senate, and by Congressman Doggett and then Congressman McGovern and Marino, the co-chairs of the Cystic Fibrosis Caucus, in the House. And what this legislation does is it makes permanent a law that passed in 2010 called the Improving Access to Clinical Trials Act. Now, this law that passed in 2010, it allows those who receive SSI and Medicaid benefits to participate in rare disease clinical trials and receive compensation for taking part in those clinical trials without that compensation counting against their income for the purposes of eligibility for SSI and Medicaid. And where this original legislation came from, now in 2009, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation identified a need through our clinical trials network, where we were seeing folks who wanted to take part in clinical trials, but they were afraid if they did and they received compensation that they would lose their benefits. And as many of you know, I mean, I know about half of those with cystic fibrosis receive some sort of public assistance. And for our folks, those benefits are critical. They're critical to affording everyday life, things you need for everyday life, and for affording your medical care. So this is a big concern. So we worked with then Congressman Markey and then Congressman Stearns and Senator Wyden on legislation in 2009 and 2010 to disregard up to $2,000 of compensation for taking part in clinical trials from eligibility for from their eligibility for benefits. So we were successful in passing that legislation in 2010. It was really fantastic. It passed under UC. It was very non-controversial, and we were able to get it done. So it passed in 2010, and the only thing about that legislation is that there was an expiration date. There was something called a sunset in that bill. So the bill sunsetted 5 years after it passed. So the sunset actually comes up in October 2015. So this year we ended up working with Senator Wyden once again, and he got Senators Hatch, Brown, and Markey on board over there in the Senate, and we worked with Congressman Doggett in the House to get legislation to make it permanent. Now, this is probably the simplest piece of legislation that you will ever see. It is literally one line, the bill, the legislative text itself, just removing the sunset. So it's just all the bill does is make this bill permanent. And we have heard from our folks in our clinical trials network, and we've done a survey of our clinical trials network research coordinators to see what the impact has been over the last 5 years of this legislation. And from what we're hearing, it's working. People are able to take part in clinical trials more often, and they are doing so without fear of losing their benefits. So we would like to see this legislation passed. We'd like to see the Improving Access to Clinical Trials Act become permanent and permanently remove this barrier to clinical trial participation for those with rare diseases. So far we've had a lot of luck. The bill was recently hotlined in the Senate, which means that it's a non-controversial bill and that Senate leadership and committee leadership all agreed that the bill was non-controversial. And they sent an email around to everyone in the Senate saying, we'd like to move this bill forward. We'd like to move this bill forward by a voice vote under unanimous consent. So far, the bill hasn't advanced to the floor, but we hope it will do so this week. We're kind of trying to identify the holdup in the Senate right now, but it's our hope that it'll move forward. We feel like it's pretty non-controversial. In the House, we have about 7 co-sponsors and growing. Actually, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had our big lobby day last week, where we had about 130 members of the cystic fibrosis community come into town to advocate for this bill. So we've got a growing number of co-sponsors in the House. We were really happy to see that. So that's moving forward. And also we had a letter that we circulated, which many of you may have seen or even signed on to, that we circulated last month. And we got about 76 co-sponsors or co-signers onto a letter in support of the Ensuring Access to Clinical Trials Act. And that included the National Organization for Rare Disorders has been very active on this, Muscular Dystrophy Association, BIO, a lot of other folks have been very active in supporting this, so we are grateful for their support. And we welcome any additional support. So if any of you would like to get in touch with your members to support this legislation, if you go to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation website, you can go. There's an action alert on our Become an Advocate page, and definitely contact your member there. Also, if you'd like to get involved, your organization involved a little bit more, please contact me. Again, my name is Stephanie Krenrich with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and Andy or Julia can give you my contact information, but I can spell it out for you now. My email address is skrenrich@cff.org, and I'm more than happy to talk to you a little bit more about how your organization can be involved. We feel like this is critically important legislation for moving clinical trials forward. I know in the cystic fibrosis community, we have 18 clinical trials in 2015 alone, and we know that the need for clinical trial participants is just as important and just as dire in every rare disease community. I mean, there aren't that many people with rare diseases. So we need to make it so that everyone can take part who wants to take part in clinical trials without unnecessary barriers. So that's the legislation in a nutshell. And again, I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to talk about it a little bit. And I welcome any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Stephanie. This sounds like a really, really great bill and a really easy way for advocates to engage and get their community or get their patient organization to sign on. And if you guys, I'm going to post these slides, and I will include Stephanie's contact information in that post. So be looking out on rareadvocates.org. We'll post and make it easy for advocates that want to take action on this to do so. So thanks so much for calling in today, Stephanie. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask if there's any questions on the line for Stephanie about the Ensuring Access to Clinical Trials. If you have any questions, please submit them through the chat function on the webinar. All right, seeing as there's no questions, we will move on. Jim Kaufman is on the line from Children's Hospital Association, and he's going to give a presentation on the Advancing Care for Exceptional Kids Act. Jim.
Thanks, Andy. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to present to your group today. Just a little background. I'm Jim Kaufman. I'm Vice President of Public Policy for the Children's Hospital Association, and we represent about 225 children's hospitals across the country with the goal of improving children's health care, and that really is a key part of this legislation. And the first slide shows a graphic that we've actually been using up on Capitol Hill, because when we've been talking to legislators and their staffs about children with medical complexity, they were having a hard time understanding the type of kids that we were talking about. And this was actually a graph that Lily's parents mapped out that showed all the services, both medical, insurance, social, home, that her parents are currently coordinating to take care of Lily. And we asked permission to use this circle of care because we thought it was a really great example to kind of put a face on the issue and the challenges that we're dealing with. And we thought Lily was particularly a great example of what we were trying to show policymakers, what we're trying to improve care for, because while Lily's medical home is Children's Specialized in Mountainside, New Jersey, she also receives care at Nemours Children's Hospital in Delaware and at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. While she's on Medicaid, her parents will tell you the challenges that she has in getting care from other children's hospitals in other states because of some of the issues with the state's Medicaid program. And when we were talking to policymakers and we were talking about, under our definition of medically complex, it's about 3 million kids that are medically complex in the United States, 2 million of which are covered by Medicaid. Usually the first response we would get, oh, Medicaid, that's really important. you should go talk to the governors. And then we would pull out our second graphic, which is our next slide. And this is actually a map of the medically complex children that Denver Children's Hospital is caring for. And I would say to the staff and the policymakers, which Medicaid program do I talk to if I'm Children's Colorado? There's 23 different states represented on their map alone. And if I pull out any single children's hospital map, it'll look very, very similar because children's hospitals are serving a much larger geographic region because of the national shortage of pediatric specialists. And we're very lucky that the vast majority of kids will never see the inside of a children's hospital. However, the kids that need these services, usually they do have to travel long distances over state lines for care. And I think the policymakers started to recognize this small group of children, even though they're Medicaid, which often they defer to the states in running their Medicaid program, is a unique population that faces a unique challenge that really needs a national solution. And on our next slide, you can see that we've actually had legislation introduced in both chambers, Senate Bill 298, House Bill 546, that were introduced with very, very strong bipartisan support at the end of January. Mr. Barton and Kathy Castor introduced the House bill. We're now up to 101 co-sponsors in the House, almost evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. On the Senate side, our key champions are Mr. Grassley from Iowa and Mr. Bennett from Colorado. We currently enjoy 12 bipartisan co-sponsors, again, almost evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. We're continuing to push for co-sponsors on this legislation. And the next slide kind of gives you a quick summary of what ACE Kids is attempting to do. Because it is Medicaid, and we know because of the Supreme Court decision on the Affordable Care Act, you cannot tell the states what to do with their Medicaid programs. And many states are doing great models and really looking at how to improve care for medically complex children. The problem that we've seen is every single state is doing it independently. To really improve care for this population, we needed to create a national framework that states may opt into. So what we're doing is creating this care coordination program for children that are covered by Medicaid or CHIP that meets this medically complex definition. And the goal is to coordinate all the services that they receive. And the goal is to create nationally designated children's hospital networks, using the children's hospital to anchor the network, since most of these kids are receiving care from the hospitals today. Use the hospital as the anchor point, but really encouraging the hospitals to work with providers all across the community to ensure the child gets the best care in the best setting to achieve the best outcome. And that is the ultimate goal. And if we're successful with this model, we believe we can actually save $13 billion in total Medicaid spending over 10 years. And the next slide shows exactly where the saving is coming from. What we believe is actually with better care coordination and a little bit of flexibility in how providers can use those resources, we can actually reduce emergency room utilization, reduce inpatient utilization. But to achieve those savings, we actually need to improve investments in primary care, specialty care, home care, pharmaceutical access. And even with all that, we need to invest in care coordination. But even with all those additional investments, the savings on the inpatient side and the emergency room side, we believe we can save about 2%, which, as I mentioned, is about a $13 billion spend over 10 years. Now, that, I should note, is not a Congressional Budget Office score. We are continuing to work with the Congressional Budget Office to get the legislation scored. One of the questions that they often have for us is, well, wait a minute, if states can do this already, is there a savings there? We believe one of the key components here is a national framework that will improve data for all across the country. That'll really lead to improved care regardless of the state that they're located in. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to note was the Children's Hospital Association, working with 10 hospitals, actually received a Medicaid and Medicare Innovation Center grant last year. That grant is allowing us to take the concepts that are included in the ACE Kids legislation, the care coordination models, and start to move them into practice at 10 hospitals. Now, people will say, well, great, you got the grant, we don't need to move the legislation. However, the grant is currently stuck within the state Medicaid framework. We cannot create the national framework without federal legislation. We cannot create a more consistent database that will really be the long-term driver for improving quality of care without the legislation. At the same time, we need the hospitals to start thinking about how do they change their models of care? How do they start improving care coordination? How do they start to delivery transformation for this very small population? And that is where the grant is an important part in moving us to that next step. The last slide shows basically we're asking for different organizations to help us express support for the ACE Kids legislation. To learn more about this bill, I would encourage everybody on the line to visit Speak Now for Kids. You can go onto our website, learn more about the legislation, as well as act now and reach out to members of Congress asking them to co-sponsor the legislation. So with that, Andy, I'll kick it back to you for questions or to move on to our next speaker.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. It's an adorable last slide you have there. I think that'll invoke a lot of action. Great. If anybody has any questions on the line, I'm going to remind you to try to use the chat function on the webinar, and then I can relay those questions to Jim. So as I do not see any questions on the line, I will move forward. Thank you so much, Jim, and we'll have these slides posted on our website. All right. Next, further presentation, we have Stephanie Bozarth from the National MPS Society. She's going to talk about access to 21st century cures for individuals with rare diseases. Stephanie, take it away.
Hi. I'm Stephanie, and I actually work for, or not work, but I'm a volunteer parent and president of the National MPS Society. We represent kids with mucopolysaccharidosis and related diseases, and I'm so excited about this, what we've been working on, this sign-on letter, and we've gotten a lot of support. So I want to thank all of you who signed on to our patient letter for the National MPS Society that circulated regarding access to rare disease therapies. So far, we have 135 signatures to date. It is an incredible example of how strong our rare disease community is when we work together. If you haven't already signed on, though, it is not too late. I'm on the call today not only to express my sincere thank you for your support, but also I want to give you a little more background on the issue. Overall, our goal with the proposed legislation is to amend the current statute within CMS in order to prohibit the rationing and waivers that allow states to force patients onto therapies that are not approved by FDA when there is an FDA-approved therapy available. Why is this? Well, because many rare disease patients enrolling in Medicaid cannot access life-saving and life-improving FDA-approved therapies because of barriers that make it impossible for rare disease patients to benefit from medical innovation. As organizations are committed to advancing these innovative technologies that can diagnose, treat, and potentially cure rare diseases, we need to also ensure that our patients have access to these innovations. So we are asking Congress to use 21st century cures to prohibit Medicaid plans from rationing access to rare disease therapies. Of course, without access, innovation means nothing for those patients. So right now, states are claiming, and there's some states, not all, but there are some states and some examples where they're claiming a conflicting federal statutes, giving them authority to use step therapy protocols as part of a prior authorization to deny access to a medically necessary therapy. Despite recognizing the significant risk that the forced use of an alternative treatment might pose on a patient health outcome and the increased cost to the healthcare system, CMS has not intervened. CMS also, in some instances, has enabled rationing through Medicaid waivers. Simply put, congressional intervention through legislation is needed to expand the path to 21st century cures to ensure access to the 21st century cures. So we are proposing a solution that is based on our understanding of the direct correlation between innovation and access, which has been gleaned from decades of efforts advocating for new and improved technology. Before restricted access to rare disease therapies became a public health crisis for not only millions of Medicaid beneficiaries, we urge Congress to address this issue through 21st century cures. More specifically, we are asking Congress to enact legislation that will prohibit discriminatory utilization control practices by state Medicaid plans. the legislation that we have titled EPIC, this EPIC legislation would ensure, 1, equity for individuals with rare diseases and conditions, P, physicians and patient treatment determination, innovation of and access to individualized treatment and continuity of care. So each one of those started with one of the letters of EPIC. To the EPIC legislation would clarify that Medicaid drug coverage provision in Section 1927 of the Social Security Act to ensure patients with rare diseases are able to access medically necessary covered outpatient drugs when prescribed for their Food and Drug through the Food and Drug Administration approved use. The legislation would serve as a clarifying amendment to Section 1927 of the Social Security Act. So under current law, prescription drug coverage is an optional benefit in traditional Medicaid. In providing this benefit, states must cover medically necessary covered outpatient drug if the manufacturer of the such drug has executed a Medicaid drug rebate agreement with CMS. Medically necessary covered outpatient drugs include those prescribed for uses approved by the FDA or supported in compendia with specified in Section 1927 of the SSA. Although states may use prior authorization programs to manage utilization of covered outpatient drugs, such programs shall not deny Medicaid beneficiaries access to the such drugs that are medically necessary for them. So a state may obtain a Section 1115, that's 1115 demonstration project waiver to relax its obligations under Section 1902 of the SSA. But such waivers do not allow a state to circumvent the requirements and limitations found in 1927 of the SSA, which controls how such drugs are covered. So I know that's a lot and a big mouthful to take in. It is described also in our letter. Basically, the policy rationale is that states are skirting their obligation under the federal Medicaid law to cover medically necessary therapies. Federal legislation that would both prevent CMS from enabling states to ration rare disease therapies through Medicaid waiver and clarify the congressional intent of a prior authorization programs in Medicaid is critical in the context of rare disease therapies. Such amendment would, 1, provide needed clarification to existing federal law to ensure health care equity of Medicaid beneficiaries with rare diseases. 2, it would improve the health outcomes for Medicaid beneficiaries with rare diseases, which will reduce the economic burden on Medicaid and other federal state net programs. 3, it would preserve the continuity of care for Medicaid beneficiaries with rare disease. 4, it would promote the value of an FDA label. 5, it would offer hope to millions of Americans affected by one of the nearly 7,000 life-threatening and debilitating rare diseases that lacks an FDA-approved treatment. So the sign-on letter has specific examples and policy rationale and legislative legislation. It is on RDLA's website. If you haven't already signed on to the letter, it is still not too late to do so. You can contact me by my email, and it's at stephanie.bozarth@mpssociety.org, and I think it should be also in that information. You'll be able to access it from the RDLA site.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Andy from RDLA. I was wondering if there is a deadline for the sign-on letter.
Well, we did circulate the letter last week by sending out some emails, as well as we had these letters hand-delivered. So, and at that point, actually, we only had 133 signatures, but soon after we got a couple more, and it's interesting, even over the weekend, I got a couple more. So really, we're just going to continue to accept signatures, and as we're moving through this 21st Century Cures process, we'll resubmit it with the additional signatures, but we are posting it online with all the signatures. So another thing that I did want to bring up is that, so in the next couple of weeks, we have a couple of meetings already set up to talk to key legislators about this concern of ours and about the sign-on letter. So if you have specific examples, if you have experienced this and, you know, and happen to live close to this area, which there are a lot of rare disease patients that are in the area of DC, we would certainly love for you to join us in those meetings, and we will give you more specifics. You just need to give me a call or an email, and I would love to have you come join our team to go to those meetings on the Hill and really speak to what this means, as you know, personally. So at this point, I would like to leave it out there for some questions. I actually think I even have some other folks on here that are really good with this and understanding this legislation or what we're proposing in the sign-on letter to answer those as well. So are there any questions right now? I can't see anything, Andy, so you let me know.
Looking through to see if there's any questions right now. There's a couple comments, but no exact questions on the line, and I'll be sure to forward you any comments or questions that any of the advocates have after the presentation today. But seeing as there aren't any pertinent questions, I just want to say that it is some really epic legislation, and we're really happy that you're moving forward and trying to get all these sign-ons. I think the rare disease community will benefit greatly from your efforts, Stephanie. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and again, thank you to all those organizations that have already signed on. It's really given it some feet. So this is great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if anybody wants to sign on or wants more information, they can contact me or Stephanie, and we'll get you situated. So thank you so much. Next presentation we have is my colleague, Max Braunstein. He's the Senior Director of Public and Government Affairs for the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Max, you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. So what I'll be talking about today is where we sort of see things potentially going with NIH funding. And just as background, I think most of you probably are aware of how critical the NIH is in terms of funding basic research, but obviously research that could have a huge impact for the rare disease community. So just to start out here, what you're seeing in front of you is the sort of background of where the NIH budget has come and gone over the past 10 years here, and we can actually divide this up into a few different periods. So the section on the left there, that was during the NIH doubling period. We're pretty far from that nowadays, and then you can see the next section over, the budget basically flattened out with one major exception, and that was during the economic turndown, and during that time, Congress actually passed about $10 billion in additional funding to be spent over 2 years through the NIH. So those funds were certainly welcome at the time. Of course, one of the major challenges was when the agency got that huge boost, after those 2 years were over, that money dried up. So that was a sort of big challenge for the agency and for the researchers who are being supported by those funds. And that actually brings us to where things have gotten today. So we're well into the sort of sequestration and stagnation mode. You can actually see the impact of sequestration in 2013, that big drop there. And then today, you know, we're basically at the point where we've totally flatlined in terms of overall NIH funding. So this has very big implications for researchers, for patients, and for all the people who rely on NIH in the medical field. So to make things a little confusing here, since I'm going to be talking about funding, I have to give you just a little bit of terminology here. So if you guys have been reading the papers, you've probably heard about the various budgets that have been released by the House and by the Senate. Couple takeaways from the budgets. So the budgets are really a way of doing a couple things. One is sort of the spending vision for the country over the next 10 years. And when we're looking at the sort of 10-year long-term side of things, those are really recommendations. Those are not legally binding. Those are things that probably won't be enacted, you know, 5–10 years down the road. But what is really important is the budgets that are agreed to by the House and Senate, decides the top line spending limit. That's the maximum amount of money that Congress can elect to spend in a given fiscal year. Also important to point out that those spending limits are not signed, not approved by the president. So he's actually not involved in that process, although the president does release his budget to Congress, which happens earlier in the year. You're going to hear me talk about appropriations and also talk about authorization. So appropriations refers to the annual process that Congress undertakes, usually in the sort of early to late summer, when they make decisions about how much to fund each agency or each department by, and this is something, again, that happens every single year. And then there's also authorization. So this is a separate sort of legislative mechanism. Authorization or an authorizing bill is something that would create the legal authority for a program to exist, or it would allow Congress to spend at a specific level. So hopefully that's clear. And the reason I'm mentioning this is you'll see later in the presentation I've identified some authorizing bills that are out there. There are a lot of members of Congress who have various, policy positions. They might be champions for NIH or for other agencies, and if they're not on the Appropriations Committee, they can still introduce what we call authorizing legislation to actually try to influence the appropriations process. So that'll make more sense as we go along here. This is just a very quick overview of what the budget process actually looks like, also the appropriations process. I'm not going to go into much detail here because I want you all to stay awake during my talk, but also because, we'll be sending these slides out, so if you guys really want to get into further detail on this, you can certainly have the opportunity to do that. So as a reminder, you can see the March, April, May, we're in the sort of budget time period now, and then as we start getting towards the summer months, we'll get into more of the appropriations process. That's when Congress starts making decisions about specific agencies, departments, and programs. So it's a much more finer level of granularity in terms of spending decisions. And the idea is that this process is supposed to complete by the end of September, which is when the fiscal year actually ends. So if Congress doesn't make a decision about funding, there's two potential outcomes. One is what's called a continuing resolution. This is when Congress basically decides that they can't set priorities and they just fund the entire government at the previous fiscal year. And then the other potential outcome is the government shutdown, which has been a threat in past years. So not sure if we'll see those again this year. I've heard a lot that the appropriations chairmen and other folks are really interested in keeping the government going and actually getting these appropriation bills done. And then the last step is for the president to sign on to them. Let's see, get this slide to advance here. Okay. So, and in addition to the sort of appropriations process, in parallel are all these discussions from the sort of advocacy community, from folks in patient organizations, folks at universities, people who care about the NIH budget. And so there's actually been a split in the community this time around. There's a couple of different asks for the total NIH budget. So if you all recall the first slide, the NIH is currently funded at about $30 billion. And so the ask for 2016, which is the next fiscal year, has been split. There's some groups calling for total funding of $33 billion, and some groups calling for an increase of $32 billion. I will say that the Every Life Foundation has been working with Research America and other groups that are leaders in this area, and those groups are leaning towards and endorsing the $33 billion number, which is a larger increase. So in addition to that, there are new authorization bills that have come out in Congress. There's been quite a few. I'm going to pull them all up here. I'm not going to go into deep detail on all of these bills. I think the top line for these is that a lot of them would actually exempt the NIH from any potential sequestration. Some of them would create these very special sort of carve-outs and set-aside funds to ensure that there's funding for NIH and other biomedical research programs for the next 5 or 10 years. So You know, these are really important bills because it shows that, you know, we have champions for medical research in Congress, and it's certainly important to acknowledge them. I should also mention that for all of these bills here, the vast majority of them have only received support from Democrats so far, so certainly one thing to keep in mind. In terms of what this all means for advocates, so there's an action alert being circulated from Research America. It takes about 20 seconds to fill that form out and to write your members of Congress asking for higher funding levels for NIH and for other research agencies. So I'd encourage folks to check that out if they want to take action. In terms of those authorizing bills that I mentioned, certainly feel free to jot down those bill numbers if it seems like something you want to endorse or get more information about. Certainly contact your member of Congress, and you can ask them to co-sponsor to sign on to that bill. The link in this will allow you to actually identify your members and send them an email. Lastly, yeah, if you guys have questions, feel free to raise them now, or if you're feeling a little shy, feel free to email me. I know this is kind of a confusing topic, but yeah, budget and appropriations is really an important one for when we're talking about NIH funding and for really advancing research within the rare disease community. So thank you all so much.
All right, are there any pertinent questions for Max on the line? If you could use the chat function, we'd appreciate it. Okay. We have one question from Dean Sir. He says, or he asks, what is the recommended rare disease party line response when we request NIH funding to be exempt from sequestration? And where should the budget be cut if not across the board?
Right. So thanks so much for the question, Dean. So yeah, I'm glad you raised this because when advocates go into offices, they often get this type of question where they'll say, we think you should boost funding for NIH or for FDA or for any agency. And some staffers or members of Congress may reply that, okay, well, we're at a budget constraint, so we can boost it here, but that means we would have to cut it elsewhere. That's actually kind of a rhetorical trap that I would recommend avoiding. And the way you can do that is by reminding members of Congress that, their job is really about setting priorities, right? So your job as a rare disease advocate is to stick to what you know, sort of stick to your message, talk about rare diseases, tell your patient story, and explain why NIH funding is critical to that. I think all of us have opinions about other areas of the government that we think should be cut or are not as important. But, you really want to avoid that and just remind Congress that it's, at the end of the day, it's their job to set priorities. And sometimes, yes, they're going to have to make tough decisions, but that's their decision to make. Your job as the advocate is to go in, explain to them why funding for NIH or for FDA is really top of line and should be their sort of #1 priority.
Wow, great response, Max. I think that's really important for our advocates to hear is just, stay to their message and stick to what they know. So that's great. Well, I want to thank everybody on the call today. If there are any additional questions or if there are any other issues that you would like to bring up, now's the time to ask them or bring the questions up. Please use the chat function and I will unmute your call line. So our goal for our next meeting is to have a staffer from Energy and Commerce come to talk about the latest draft of 21st Century Cures that we hope to be out sometime in April. So keep engaged, keep on the lookout for our next RDLA meeting date. I'll be sure to post it on our website and on Facebook and all those good sites that you guys love to use. So we're really excited for this next draft of 21st Century Cures, and we can't wait to see what's in it. So as I see there are no other questions on the line, I will unmute everybody for 1 second. Okay. All right, are there any questions on the line?
So maybe while Andy's unmuting everybody, we had one sort of comment earlier about what the background on 21st Century Cures is. So just to remind folks who might not be plugged in, the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is a very powerful committee, has taken up the charge here around biomedical research, and they're working on what is, which could become a fairly comprehensive piece of legislation to try to accelerate the pace of biomedical innovation in the U.S. And I know that's a very broad sort of description and charge, but the first draft that came out was over 400 pages, so there's a huge amount of information in that bill. In terms of action steps for advocates there, the Life Foundation and others were circulating a sign-on letter just to thank the Energy and Commerce Committee for incorporating the rare disease patient community in that process. So if folks want to sign their organization on to that letter, do email me. The process for 21st Century Cures is still ongoing. We've heard that at the moment it's been tabled a little bit because there's another issue relating to SGR reform that really takes up the time of the committee. But we're hoping that they'll get back and focused on 21st Century Cures soon. And as Andy mentioned, we're hopeful to see another draft soon.
All right, great. Thank you, Max. And I have a question about Stephanie Bozarth's presentation. We will be, like I said, we will be posting these slides online. And so I will also post Stephanie's letter from the MPS Society that she's circulating. So you guys that want a more deeper dive into the issue of access to 25 cures for individuals with rare diseases, you can take a look at it online at your own pace. And you can really make the decision of whether you guys want to support it or not, or take it back to your patient community. So I will be posting that on rareadvocates.org. All right, one last call for questions. If there are any questions or comments out there from any of the participants, now's the time to make your voice heard. All right, seeing as there's no questions, I just want to thank everybody again for joining the call today. I especially want to thank our rare disease legislative advocate for paying attention and being such great, compassionate advocates. You guys are the best. So stay engaged. Check out Rare Advocates. Check out our Facebook page. And we look forward to hearing from you guys on the next legislative call in April. So thanks so much. I want everybody to have a great day. And if you have any questions, you feel free to give me a call or email arussell@everylifefoundation.org. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Great job, you guys.